took off his hat to fan himself, more used to digging in the Devon rain than the Sicilian sun. He could see the dog lying in the shade of an olive tree, apparently without a care in his canine world. Apart from a brief sojourn in Virginia, Neil had spent most of his archaeological career in the UK, and he'd never before worked on a site where stray dogs were accepted as a fact of life. But many things were different in Sicily. Teresa, the postgrad student from Palermo University, who was digging beside him, looked across and smiled. "Our dogs surprise you?" She was olive-skinned, slender and beautiful, her only blemish being a nose that was a little too long for classical perfection. Her English was fluent, putting his attempts at Italian to shame. "Archimedes just lies there and watches what's going on. I've never come across such a polite dog on a dig before." He had named the dog on his first day there. It had seemed appropriate, Archimedes being one of the island's most famous former residents. "One of the guides who works here says they're not stray dogs. They're free dogs. The temples are their home." "I've seen him feeding them," said Neil. "Looks like it's not only us Brits who are a nation of animal lovers." Teresa flashed him another smile, as though she took his observation as a compliment, and he squatted down again. In spite of the heat, he wanted to carry on. This was an irresistible opportunity to get stuck into some real classical archaeology after so many years directing excavations in Devon. He still wasn't quite sure how he'd managed to wangle a fortnight digging in the Valley of the Temples, supposedly supervising a group of students from his old university, but somehow he'd done it through his professional contacts. Sunshine and Greek remains. What could be better for a jaded archaeologist who'd spent the winter buried in desk-based assessments and paperwork? However, he'd soon be back in England, taking charge of the community dig near Neston, where his partner Lucy was already working. A deep English voice suddenly interrupted his thoughts of home. "Found anything interesting?" The newcomer had stepped through the flimsy safety barrier erected to separate the dig from the wandering tourists, and was standing a little too close to the edge of the trench for Neil's liking. Dressed in black from head to toe, he was in his 30s, with piercing blue eyes and dark hair tied back in a ponytail. He had the look of an athlete who'd stopped training some time ago, lithe, but beginning to expand a little around the middle, and there was a controlled watchfulness about him, as though he was viewing the diggers as specimens under a microscope, which Neil found a little disconcerting. The man lifted his camera, a heavy professional model with an elaborate lens. He never seemed to go anywhere without a suitcase full of expensive photographic equipment. "What did you say this temple's called?" "The Temple of Olympian Zeus, 5th century BC, Neil answered, before turning his attention to the section of temple wall emerging from the earth. When they'd first met a few days ago, the photographer had introduced himself as Barney Yelland, and told him he was over in Sicily taking photographs for a book he was working on, In the Footsteps of the Grand Tourists. It was to be a coffee-table book of photographs, he'd said, confessing rather sheepishly that someone else was writing the text. The publisher who'd commissioned it had insisted that it would be a surefire commercial success. Sicily, with its magnificent classical ruins and rich history, was the final stop on his list of destinations. Their conversation had rarely ventured into the realm of the personal, but when Neil had asked whereabouts in England Yelland came from, he was surprised when the answer was South Devon. Neil himself had spent much of his working life in that area, and when he'd mentioned this, the photographer had shown a polite but distant interest. Assuming Yelland was alone in a strange land, Neil had felt obliged to invite his compatriot to join the diggers at the trattoria in Agrigento they frequented each evening. Yelland had turned up a couple of times, sitting quietly, paying particular attention to one of the more beautiful female students,